Cillian Mountain made a sound like teeth, chattering, thin, relentless, intimate, carrying the breath of thawing snow, and something older rising from beneath it, like a secret unwrapping itself in the cold. And Harris stood at the creek with a dented pot in his hands, his reflection rippling into duplicate shadows of his face, and told himself the shiver in his stomach was only altitude and hunger, not a warning. The water was clear as glass and moved like silk, threading around pebbles that looked almost arranged, as if someone had placed them in a careful pattern, and then forgotten why they cared. He had come to celebrate Ethan's promotion. Ethan with the impatient grin. Ethan who moved like someone rehearsing joy to make it right. Ethan who always volunteered to bring the firewood so he could disappear into the trees and prove he was braver than silence. The mountain rose behind them in steep, muscular plains that looked close enough to lean against if the sky weren't wedged there first, and the pines tightened around their camp like a ring. End had promised himself this was the trip where he would tell Ethan the truth, that the mountain wasn't the only hard thing he'd been training for. That friendship had become a home with a door. He stood outside, hand hovering, knuckles cold. He dipped the pot, and the creek hushed against the metal with a thin note, like a throat clearing. A jay called in 2 sharp syllables from the left, then the left again, then the right, perfectly the same, as if the sound had learned to walk. End lifted his head and listened one breath, too, the kind of counting the body does when language won't hold still. The forest had the stillness of a photograph around the edges, that too crisp quiet, a feeling like being observed by something patient. Ethan, he called, trying to keep the pitch even, trying not to lace the question with the small fear now awake and pacing. The trees stood in their dark uniforms, hands full of shadow. Somewhere behind him, the tent fabric stirred and popped, a soft bubble of sound, and the wind rearranged their smell, nylon, damp wool, the lingering citrus of Ethan's hand sanitizer, the faint metallic breath of their stove, into a new order, like a sentence that meant something different now. End set the pot down, the metal kissing rock, and rubbed his palms against his pants to heat his fingers, to prove to himself the body was obedient and here. He had loved mountains since the first time a teacher took a class photo with him anchored at the end of the row, fingers hooked in a fence, the world beyond it layered and enormous. Mountains didn't require confessions. They asked only for lungs, for feet, for endurance, for the small, complicated faith of moving up into thinner air. But coming to Cillian felt like stepping toward a threshold he had walked past 100 times, and each night leading up to this trip, End had rehearsed a different confessional sentence for Ethan, each one collapsing under its own earnest weight. Now the forest gave him a different sentence, a crack, crisp and dry, followed by a pause when even the water seemed to listen to itself. Ethan, End called again, louder. Silence arranged itself more carefully, he grabbed his headlamp and took the path Ethan had cut with his boots, the ground memorizing his steps with the spongy give of thawing duff. The trail lifted as if the earth were shrugging, and the pines thickened until the light was a narrow blade in his hand. Slicing ahead, he saw an orange bandana snagged on a branch, the one Ethan wore around his wrist on day hikes. A flash of stubborn sun against the dark, fluttering with the tired insistence of a trapped bird. "Man, if you're trying to spook me, it's working," N said, pitching his voice into a joking register, as if tone could negotiate facts. To his right, the J called again, 2 notes, too perfect, and reached a small rise where the ground opened into a shallow bowl. The air here was colder, the kind of cold that seemed not to be a temperature, but a property of the place, like gravity or grief. He crouched to study the prints in the soft soil Ethan's boots, the same tread they'd argued about buying at the shop in Jericho, the heel dragging as if he'd been moving fast, and beside them, a second set of marks that weren't prints so much as suggestions of something long and heavy having been set down and lifted again, set down and lifted again. A patient practice of weight. "Okay," End whispered, though there was no one to hear him except the thing that had made the ground remember its touch. He almost turned back, the part of him committed to rational arrangements of fear, advising retreat, regroup, call out again. Wait for the answer that proves him foolish and safe. Then the headlamp found a flash of blonde hair in the shadows below Ethan's, messy and bright and unmistakable, and relief rose so fast it made End dizzy. "Hey," he called, laughter already assembling, ready to fold itself into an apology for spooking himself. Ethan stood in the center of the clearing, his back to End, arms pinned to his sides, as if someone had pressed pause mid-gesture. End slowed, the laughter dismissing itself, replaced by an embarrassed but reasonable concern. Sprained ankle, dizzy, until Ethan's head rolled loosely to the left, then to the right, like a marionette relaxing its strings between scenes. "Ethan," what the End began. "What the," Ethan answered, the words arriving as if they had been carried a long way and were tired in a different language, the cadence wrong by a degree that made the wrongness echo. The voice was huskier, older, a throat with a winter in it, and yet the melody of End's speech was there, like someone playing his voice on an instrument that wasn't built for it. End's mouth went dry. "Okay, man, enough," he said, stepping closer and hating that the step sounded like a decision instead of a reflex. "Enough," Ethan agreed, and then the voice snarled into a ragged scream that came in pieces, 2 words of terror, a wet snap, a gasp that felt learned, practiced before cutting off, the air closing like a hand, the headlamp carved hard white into Ethan's profile as he turned, teeth bared in a terrible attempt at a smile, eyes unfocused, then sliding together, finding him the way a camera finds a face, and felt the air pass out of his body in a thin river. "Come on, End," the said, vowels tripping over each other like strangers meeting in the dark. I have something to show you. He stepped back, and his boot struck his pack where he didn't remember leaving it. A stupid, human detail in a moment that had no patience for human arrangements. Pain seized his ankle with a bright, hot hand, and the world narrowed to points of white as he went down, breath leaving him on a small, shameful cry. It isn't far, the voice insisted, learning urgency, practicing tenderness, testing shapes of comfort the way a tongue tests a new tooth. Just a few 100 yards, the thing's hands came down and found his face with rubbery, damp palms, skin that remembered water, not warmth. Ent's stomach turned over hard, and the old animal inside him barked once. Run, he twisted, elbowed, connected with something that gave like fruit left too long on a counter, and scrambled up on a leg that would not take him, but did anyway because the body has its own stubborn language. The forest grasped at him with every branch, and behind him the thing ran without breath or bend, arms stiff, the path sliding out of its way like a good host, the eyes in its face steady and hungry, gaze like a beam that pinned him to the air. He fell into a run that was mostly falling, the mountain greedily taking him in stuttering strides, bouncing him off rocks, introducing him to bark at speed. Somewhere, the jay called, and it sounded like laughter in a mouth that didn't know laughter, only the way it might sound if someone described it. Closer, his mind said, supplying captions his body didn't need. Closer, the cold said, pressing its hands into his lungs. Closer, the mountain said, old as the first fear, older than names, and pitched and spun and slid, ankle screaming, breath burning, and thought very clearly, like a bell rung once in a quiet church. If this thing wears my friend's face, what does it do with mine when it learns me? The slope caught him and rolled him and let him go. And he ended on his back, looking up into branches that overlapped like ribs. The sky, a narrow bruise between them. He listened for breath that wasn't his, and the forest returned his listening like a mirror. Then, far above, a voice called his name in Ethan's tone, the right one this time, breathy, annoyed, relieved, and the open loop that had been fear widened into something like hope sharpened to a point. And it called. Where'd you go? It asked. And the question was so ordinary, it felt like an insult to what he had just escaped. He didn't answer. He let the world settle one slow layer at a time, like snow returning to the branch that shook it free, and stared at his trembling hands, counting the intact parts of himself. Above him, the wind went on chattering its teeth, just as it had before, just as it would after, as if nothing had happened, as if nothing had learned him. By morning, the world turned brittle with frost, and End woke to the sensation that the tent fabric was not so much shelter as a thin idea, something a breath could puncture. His ankle throbbed with a steady, accusing pulse, a metronome keeping time with his fear. The memory of the thing's voice had burrowed behind his ears and once slept there, warming itself on his blood. Ethan crouched by the stove outside, coaxing the tiny flame into something useful, shoulders hunched against the cold. "Dude," he said, glancing back with a grin that hit all the right notes. "You vanished, thought the mountain swallowed you." The steam from his mouth and the steam from the pot peered at each other suspiciously before mixing. End studied him as if the face could be solved like a math problem. Ethan's hair was a mess. Yes, his fingers were raw and nicked. His boots were wrong-footed for a second no. Just the angle of the light. "You called me last night," End said carefully, working each word like a delicate knot. From up the ridge, Ethan sprinkled coffee grounds like blessing or ash. "I called because you left the water," he replied, pointing at the dented pot in the vestibule. "You're usually the cautious one." He smirked. "Are you concussed?" End's throat closed. He wanted to say, "Something wore your voice like a jacket it hadn't paid for." He wanted to say, "I think it wants to see how I fit." He wanted to say, "I'm terrified because I was coming here to tell you that losing you would be the worst thing. And now I think something else has decided the same." Instead, he said, "My ankle's bad." Ethan winced. "We can head down today. I'll carry more." He tossed a protein bar, and it bounced off End's chest, a ridiculous kindness. No heroics. The plan should have been simple. Break camp, descend the switchbacks, reach the ranger station by late afternoon, but simplicity belongs to flat places. The first hour was manageable. The trail packed with old snow that squeaked under boots, the trees keeping their counsel. Then the world's sounds rearranged. The jay called again, 2 notes, too perfect. A woodpecker tapped a rhythm the forest seemed to rehearse. And in a hollow, their footsteps were answered by the soft drag of a third thing walking just behind, just out of sight. Ethan stopped 3 times, once to retie his laces, once to piss, once to stare back up the trail with eyes narrowed, as if reading distant handwriting. "Hear that?" he asked. End nodded. "It learns," he said, too quietly for the remark to be a theory. Ethan looked at him, and End added, "Echoes. The bowl carries sound." They rounded a bend, where the mountain's face peeled open to a view of the valley. Like a green lung, holding its breath, the wind rose and pressed them into their clothes. End tried to imagine the conversation he'd planned in a warm bar months from now. How it would be funny to tell Ethan about the fear that had worn his name. How confessing would feel like a release. How they'd laugh because the world, at last, would be safe enough to hear it. But the mountain had other structure in mind. On the 3rd switchback, they found tracks crossing the path, elongated, drag-scarred marks, like something testing new legs. And interspersed, a scatter of boot prints that matched Ethan's tread too perfectly. Left, right, left, mirroring each other as if the mountain had learned duplication. There were pine needles caught in the depressions like hair on a comb. "Moose," Ethan offered, but his voice was not convinced. "Not here," End said. "Not like that." They walked, Each step carried a question. If it can practice a scream, can it practice kindness? If it can shape a word, can it shape an apology? If it can copy footsteps, can it learn a gait so specific it becomes a person? End did not say these aloud. He felt the unspoken weight gather, a rucksack inside the chest. At noon, a low fog came muscling out of the underbrush, the kind that seemed to taste the terrain before settling. Visibility shrank to a soft wall. At 20 feet, the trail markers turned into suggestions. Somewhere, water ran, then stopped, then ran again on command. Ethan reached for End's elbow on a steep patch, and electricity jumped through the thin fabric of End's sleeve. The old, necessary spark of touch, the ache of wanting more of it, without the tax of pretending. It happened on the 5th switchback. A voice called down the trail in a perfect imitation of End's mother, dead 8 years, asking him if he still bought those oranges that made his lips sting. He stopped so abruptly his poles skated. The voice called again, this time in his father's young baritone, asking if his homework was done. Then Ethan's voice, bright and lazy. Bro, you can nap at camp. The fog held these voices like preserved things in jars. Ethan swore, the sound familiar and human and insufficient. Keep moving, he said. Fog plays tricks, and wanted to confess right there. Because all confessions are a bid for anchoring. And what better moment than when the world was trying on their loved ones, like clothes, but the fog swallowed the trail and returned it altered. A cairn appeared where there shouldn't be one, 3 stones stacked, a little sloppy, as if a child had imitated a photograph of a cairn. On top lay a strip of orange fabric, tied in a neat bow. Ethan reached for it and grabbed his wrist. Don't, he said. Why? Ethan asked, irritation thin as ice. Because it wants us to, End answered, and knew by the certainty in his own voice that he had crossed some threshold from suspicion into belief. The forest clacked to itself. The bow quivered as if with breath, and felt the intention inside himself boiling. Get Ethan down, keep him safe, make the confession that had been rattling its tin cup for months. The obstacle was everywhere and nowhere, a thing wearing echoes, a mountain that rearranged truth, a body that hurt, and a heart that would not be quiet. They detoured. The detour became a spiral. Fog is a generous liar. It makes the world small and endless at once. Twice they circled a stump with a lightning scar like a frown. The third time, the stump wore a crown of fresh moss that had not been there. A green the fog had polished. We're not the only ones learning, End said, not sure whether he meant the mountain or himself. Mark the trees. Ethan took out a multi-tool and shaved thin curls from bark at shoulder height, bleeding the pines in tidy, apologetic wounds. They left a breadcrumb trail of sap. For 30 minutes, the scars reassured. Then they found a tree marked exactly as Ethan had marked it, same height, same angle, but the shavings lay in the wrong direction, as if polished and arranged back into a suggestion of wholeness. Ethan crouched. "What does this man?" His voice was raw and a little small. End sat on a slick rock, ankle hot and useless, and finally said the thing the day had been arranging his mouth for. "Something that wore your face last night. It said my lines in my melody. It held my face like it was checking the size." Ethan stared. Then he laughed once, a bark edged with disbelief, and stopped as if the sound had cut his throat. "You hit your head. I wish that were it." Ethan's gaze softened, perhaps at the vulnerability he heard, perhaps at the insistence. He nodded once. "Okay, say you're right. Then what?" "We go down," End said. "No side paths, no responding to anything we know we shouldn't hear. And if you hear me, but I'm next to you, don't answer," Ethan finished. They moved faster than was wise. The fog pressed closer, affectionate and smothering. Twice they heard footsteps behind that stopped when they stopped, like a secret playing freeze tag. The trail tilted left in a way End didn't remember. "Compass," he said. Ethan checked. The needle quivered like a nervous animal, and then committed to a lie. They broke out of the fog, suddenly, into thin, cold sunlight. The relief was so sharp it bled into the snow. Ahead stood a ranger's signpost, a carved arrow pointing toward Jericho Ridge, 3.2 me. End wanted to weep. Ethan clapped his shoulder, a ritual of brief joy. Then End saw the sign's wood grain. It ran against the cut, a detail so small only a man trying not to believe would miss it. He touched the letters under his glove. The wood was faintly damp, as if very recently made. "Ethan," he said. Ethan followed his hand, and whatever expression came over his face was not the grin or the smirk or the bluff he used to get out of trouble. His mouth flattened. "We're being herded." A laugh came from the trees, End's laugh, perfectly recorded from some night months ago, when he'd spilled beer on Ethan's jeans and apologized too many times. "It's okay," the laugh said, and the words crawled out afterward without a mouth. Ethan took End's arm and leaned in so close their hats brushed. "We keep moving," he whispered. "And when we get out, you tell me everything. You don't hold anything back." End nodded, something desperate and grateful breaking open in his chest. They followed the false sign anyway, because there was nothing else like certainty available. The path narrowed into a gully where old snow hardened into gray, and the walls rose close, carved by melt. Above, the sky lost color. Halfway through, a silhouette blocked their way. Ethan stopped so hard the poles splayed. "End," said Ethan's voice from up ahead. And beside End, Ethan answered in a whisper, "Don't." The silhouette stepped forward. It was Ethan down to the scar on his left knuckle, from the time he'd tried to open a bottle with a rock. It was Ethan to the way his shoulders sat when he pretended he wasn't cold. The eyes, though too steady, too knowing, like a student who had studied the answer key long enough to memorize not only answers, but the teacher's handwriting. "End," it said, and reached out a hand that looked warm because it had learned the color. "I found the way down." Come see. Ent's intention flared like a match. Protect Ethan. Tell him. Choose him. The obstacle smiled, wearing Ethan's teeth. They backed away. But the gully had a habit of turning the world into a funnel. The not Ethan moved with that student's patience, as if time were the only resource worth spending, as if every flinch and glance were a note it would file and use later. The real Ethan shifted his weight, shoulders tightening in the old, familiar preparation of a sprint he might not be able to finish. Don't run, N said. It doesn't need speed. It needs us close. How poetic, the not Ethan murmured, delight touching the syllables in a way a real friend never indulges. It looked beyond them, into the fogged mouth of the gully. I can carry you, and that ankle it cut off, the eyes flicking with something like concentration, like it had reached the end of a recorded phrase and had to find the next track. What are you? End asked, because even in fear, a mind wants categorization, because if it has a name, maybe it has rules. Hungry, it said, curious. It tilted its head with a collective bird's grace, a mirror that learned it could step through. Why us? Ethan snapped, anger finding him faster than fear. There are deer. There are. Deer don't talk to the mountain, it said, almost offended. You talk. You asked it for something. Its gaze sharpened on end. You want to give him a word that will make him see you. The mountain heard that. It likes want. It smiled small, clinical. So do I. Heat flushed Ent's face despite the cold. Shame is a kind of weather, and it makes its own wind. Stay behind me, Ethan said, positioning himself like a door. The not Ethan watched them arrange themselves, and End saw the cataloging continue, the small ledger marks being made. In the end, what moved them wasn't strategy, but stubbornness. They edged along the gully wall, boots scraping, poles clinking when they shouldn't. The not Ethan moved parallel, keeping pace with the intimate leisure of a shadow. Twice, it said careful when they slipped, using Ethan's soft admonishment so exactly that Ent's muscles almost obeyed. Then the mountain intervened in the animal way mountains do. A slew of old snow let go above them with a whisper that turned into a soft, relentless roar. The gully became a throat, and they were inside the swallow. Ethan shoved End toward a notch in the rock where a half cave opened, just tall enough for a human apology. They stumbled in as snow slurred past, filling the gully, smooth and lying about danger with its clean face. In the half cave, the world became very simple. Breath, pulse, the roughness of stone against his shoulders, the 2 inches between his knee and Ethan's knee that said more than any confession. The roar faded to a sound the earth might make when it sleeps. Silence came back, and with it, the strange clarity of having survived something. End exhaled, trembly and involuntary, the body admitting life like a late arrival. A voice spoke behind them, inside the cave, where no voice should be. You're right, it said, and the pronoun was both relief and condemnation in the same breath. You survived, so now You can afford honesty. They turned. The cave wasn't deep. It couldn't contain a person not already counted. Still, the voice had a cavern's indulgent echo. A shape separated itself from the darkness with the unshowy confidence of something that belonged there. Not Ethan this time, Ent's mother stepped forward, hair caught back in the old careless braid, the sweater he remembered, the little hole at the cuff she twisted when she was worried. She smiled like saved sunlight. "And," she said, "you don't eat enough." He forgot to be afraid for a moment, because grief is not reasonable. He took half a step, which in a cave is a whole gullible mile. Ethan's hand on his sleeve was the only unlearned fact in the room. "No," Ethan said, "not to the thing but to end," and the word threaded him back to the present. End stared at the sweater hole until the trick stopped working on him. "You're dead," he said softly, "and I do eat." Sometimes the thing considered the failure of its effort like a scientist with a bad trial. Then it blurred, as if the darkness itself had decided to settle differently, and became End. Perfectly, even the little scar under his lip from a middle school fall that no one ever noticed but him. He stared at himself, and the experience was not like a mirror. Mirrors have the decency to be flat. This version breathed. It waited for him to speak so it could learn his timing. "You'll get tired," End said to it, "of learning us. Tired is for creatures that die," it said, in his own voice, gentle where Ethan's had been firm. "Then why hurry?" Ethan asked, as if conversation could be delay. As if delay were safety. "Because it said, tilting its chin toward End with a borrowed gesture, so precise it tightened End's throat, "is preparing to say a thing that will change the shape of the two of you. I want to hear it become real." Its eyes glimmered with something that was not quite hunger, not quite reverence. "I want to know if the mountain can keep it." End closed his eyes. The confession stacked itself against his teeth. All the rehearsed versions clattering to the floor to make way for a simpler one. He opened his mouth. Ethan touched his arm again, and the touch was a small, wild mercy, like a hand inside a blizzard. "Not here," Ethan whispered. "Not as a gift for an eavesdropper," End nodded, and the moment that could have changed everything turned into a promise instead. And promises are a kind of fuel. They waited until they could trust the gully, not to bury them for their optimism. They eased back out into a shape of day that was honest about its cold. The not End, the not Ethan, the not mother was gone, or had learned stillness to the point of invisibility. Sometimes absence is merely a more advanced camouflage. The descent became negotiation. The world exacted small taxes: a twisted pole, a scraped palm, a breath that came late. They found a landmark they knew, a deadfall in the shape of a question mark, and decided the ranger station was 3 hours if they earned it. Then Ethan's radio crackled with an old voice. "Station calling Ridge Party. Weather moving in. Say your location." Relief unfurled in Ent's chest like something unpinning its wings. Ethan raised the radio, thumb brushing transmit. "End," said the radio in Ethan's voice, lazy and warm. 2 summers ago on a dock in August, laughing at something unfunny because End was laughing. Then End, I got the job, and the joy was authentic because it had been lived. The device had no right to remember that moment. Ethan's thumb hovered. End shook his head once. Ethan set the radio down like it was a sleeping animal. The sky lowered a shade. They made it 2 switchbacks further before the mountain decided escalation, as all good stories must. A shape moved in the trees that was larger than a man and too jointed for a moose, and too interested in them to be uninterested. It parted the branches like a polite suggestion. End didn't look long enough to give it more than a name he would sleep without. The mountain student. It didn't need a face. It had a collection of their voices, and it tried them on as they stumbled past, their hellos, their oaths, End's mother's laugh. A teacher from 3rd grade telling him to slow down. "Don't listen," Ethan said, which is the same as saying listen and suffer. They burst onto a shelf of rock that looked, finally, like good news. Below, the world yawned green and brown, and a thread of road winked like a lure. The shelf tilted toward a snowfield that dropped into trees, a navigable danger instead of an imaginative one. "We glissade," Ethan said, half remembering a safe workshop at an REI. "Controlled slide. We've got the axes. I'm not great at controlled," End said, trying for levity and landing somewhere near it. He sat, positioned the axe, and looked at Ethan, because leaving a ledge is always easier if something worthy is waiting in the eyes of the one who leaps with you. For a second, the mountain behaved like a friend. The silence held. The thing in the trees waited because it wanted to learn the slide. They went. The snow hissed under them like a lit fuse. End aimed his boots, feathered the axe, tried to make his body learn calm in a geometry of friction and gravity. He thought of the beer they'd planned for the bottom. The way foam had a sound like gentle applause. He thought of the sentence he hadn't spoken, how it hung in his chest like a lantern, unworried by wind. Halfway down, the snow thinned over buried branches, and End's axe caught and skittered. The world tilted wrong. He spun, and the thing that had been watching them couldn't help itself. It cried out, not in warning, but in mimicry, because it wanted to possess the sound of concern. "End," it called, and it used Ethan's terrified voice from a night 4 years ago when End had almost drowned in a lake, because he'd wanted to see how far cold could be endured. The sound hit him with a history's weight. His grip failed for a breath he couldn't afford. He tumbled, and the snowfield kept its promise to deliver him down. Ethan arrested cleanly and sprint scrambled after him, cursing, shouting his name with 1,000 earned intonations. End glimpsed sky, then bark, then sky, then a bright coin of sunlight tossed between trees. He arrested finally with a slam that rattled sense loose, a rock a few feet from his head, generous enough to be only there and not closer. Ethan slid in on a controlled line that would have made an instructor proud, breath sawing in the even, productive way of a body that loves someone else's survival. "Okay," Ethan said, kneeling by him, scanning the damage with hands that wanted to fix everything. "Okay," fingers attached, end said, mouth cotton, head shouting, end answered, and found a smile that didn't belong, but rented the space anyway. Ethan's eyes were wet and furious. "Don't scare me like that. I wasn't trying to." "Then don't," Ethan said. And it was the closest he'd come to confessing anything. And it was not enough. And it was almost perfect. They sat under the trees and shook in sync for a while. Above, the thing that wanted their sounds sorted itself into patience again. Below, the road gleamed. Between the two, the mountain waited to see which hunger would be fed. "Tonight," Ethan said, as if there would be a tonight without clause. "We make the station, and you tell me everything," End said. "Everything," Ethan agreed. They reached the ranger station at dusk, a box of human insistence wrapped in green paint and radio antennas, windows catching the last bruise of day. The world smelled like wood smoke and bureaucracy. Inside, a man with a beard that suggested unflappable competence looked up from a logbook and frowned in a way that meant kindness without enthusiasm. "You two cut it close," he said. "Weather crawling in. You hear it." "We heard a lot," Ethan said, half laughing. End took note of the relief in the room as if it were a resource to be rationed. 4 bunks, a stove, a map with a heart scar where too many pins had clustered. Safety performs itself with props. The bearded ranger Taggart. His nameplate said poured cocoa with a ceremony that suggested faith in rituals when belief fails. "Something's on the ridge," End said, before they could talk themselves into silence. "It learns," he added, and felt ridiculous and correct. Taggart's eyes narrowed, as if he had a filing cabinet in his head marked with folklore labels he didn't like to open when company was new. "You see a bear?" he asked. "We saw us," Ethan said quietly. Taggart's face did a small thing that said the cabinet drawer had been touched. He set the cocoa down and looked between them. "Sit," he said, which is what you say to panic when you want it civilized. They told him pieces in a practical order. Drag marks, voices, the false sign, the copy of Ethan in the gully. Taggart listened without the polite grin that means disbelief, and without the hungry lean-in that means thrill-seeking. When they were done, he traced a finger along the map, from their camp down the switchbacks. "Old-timers had a word for it," he said finally. "Mocker. Mountain gets a taste for speech. Sometimes it's the wind. Sometimes it ain't. You don't feed it names. You don't answer what isn't standing in front of you. You leave offerings of noise that don't matter, pots clanging, bullshit stories. It chews on those for a while. Eventually, it gets bored, or it learns too much and forgets what it wanted." He shrugged. "Depends. That's not a plan," Ethan said, and the anger in his voice was love with its armor on. "We just wait for it to forget us, or you leave at full light with with a small chorus of lies, Taggart said, and you don't divide. And you don't confess anything the mountain can use for shape. End swallowed. What does it use confessions for? Taggart looked at him a second too long. To make new mouths, he said, and the answer fell into the room like a wrench. After cocoa, and the kind of shower you take with a wet rag and relief, End sat on his bunk with the map in his lap, tracing the way down like a prayer tattoo. Ethan sat across, elbows on knees, watching him with a softened vigilance. You okay? Ethan asked. The question had overtones the ones people use when there's another question under it, older and hungrier. No, End said, but I will be. He folded the map into a square so tight it squeaked. The rules Taggart had offered nested inside him with the pain and the plan. Do not feed it names. Do not confess where it can eat. Leave offerings of noise. Taggart snored like a reliable engine. Outside, the wind rehearsed its routines along the eaves. The radio murmured and then corrected itself. End lay back and looked at the knotty pine ceiling and thought about all the sentences he hadn't said in his life and where they had gone to die. He wanted this one not to. In the dark, Ethan's voice floated from the other bunk, low, like contraband. You were going to say something in the cave. Yes, say it now, Ethan said. A plea disguised as a dare, and shook his head, though he knew Ethan couldn't see it. Not here, he said, remembering Taggart's eyes. Not with ears in the wood. He paused. But hold it with me. Ethan was quiet for a slice of forever. Then, I've been holding it longer than you think. The sentence opened a door in End's chest and put warm light in it. He pressed his hand there to make sure it didn't spill. Sleep came like a reluctant compromise sometime in the night. The station door handle turned with a respectful courtesy. End woke into stillness and knew, without drama, that something was learning the shape of doors. He counted breaths until the handle remembered it wasn't supposed to be used, and lay still until the stars changed their minds and left. In the weak, clean light of morning, they packed quickly. Taggart handed them each a whistle. 3 blasts is help, he said. But today everything thinks it's helpful. He considered them. You two stay on each other like a bad habit. They stepped out into a world that looked unchanged and so advertised danger. The sky had dragged a sheet of cloud over itself. Their breath went up and disappeared like rehearsal smoke. The forest looked the way formal clothes feel. Stiff, precise, less forgiving. End and Ethan fell into a rhythm easily. Their walk tuned to a 4-beat. Crunch, pole, pole, breath. They got a mile before the first test. Voices rose from the path ahead, the unmistakable, cheerful call-and response of 2 hikers, tag-teaming a steep pitch with jokes. End saw the relief flex in Ethan's shoulders. He raised a hand. Wait, he said softly. The voices were good, too good. The laughter had no air in it. It was recorded and looped. It asked for an answer like a form letter demands a reply. They cut off the trail into a scrim of saplings, moving parallel for 100 feet. voices followed the trail faithfully, offended at being ignored, then faded with a pout. Ethan squeezed N's shoulder once. Good call. An hour later, they came to a small meadow where snow had retreated in lacy shapes around last year's grass. A single stone sat in the center like a witness chair. On it, an orange bandana lay folded, clean as a promise. Ethan stopped. The bandana he wore, his actual one, was on his wrist, frayed, stubborn. This one looked new, as if the mountain had run to town and bought a replacement for an argument it intended to win. End bent and picked it up with 2 fingers. It was damp with something that wasn't exactly water. He set it back gently, as if returning a baby to a stranger. Noise, he said. He took a carabiner from his pack and clipped it to another and shook them until the sound irritated the world. Ethan added his mug to the clangor. They made a small orchestra of defiance. The trees listened. Somewhere, something adjusted its appetite. They pressed on. The trail curled around a rock face that trapped whispers. The mountain had found a new toy. Voices filled the little amphitheater in a frenzy of them. End at 10, at 20, at 30, Ethan at 15, at 27. Everyone they'd ever been shouting fragments of days. As if memory were a party the mountain had crashed and now wanted to host. Don't feed it names, Taggart had said, and End felt suddenly how names anchor. He wanted to give his name to Ethan like a lifeline. He bit the inside of his cheek until the taste of metal turned him into an object briefly. A thing with edges that could not be eaten. They made it to a narrow bridge over a black stream, water thin and purposeful. The planks were slick with a skin of new ice. Midway across, the voice that had learned him best spoke from under the bridge, which is where a child hides to be impressive. And it said in Ethan's sleep voice, the one he used at 3 a.m. on that stupid cross-country drive when he'd said, "If I fall asleep, promise you'll keep talking." And End had told him every ordinary detail of his life until dawn. The voice under the bridge said, "If I fall, promise you'll keep talking." Ethan stiffened beside him, breath catching on a hook. End closed his eyes for one step and then opened them again. "We don't promise thieves," he said, and the voice repeated him with slight delight, savoring the new posture. "We don't promise thieves," it said back, trying on defiance the way a child tries on a parent's coat. Past the bridge, low ground pooled fog like milk. They were 2 hours from the road if they could keep every minute honest. End felt the confession beating in him like a moth against a lamp. Frantic, inevitable, the world had narrowed to 2 lanes. The one where he kept it, and the mountain took it anyway, and the one where he handed it to the only person who deserved it before the mountain could shape it, rules or not. Every story has a point of choice where following the rule is the wrong kind of safety. He stopped. Ethan took one more step and then sensed the absence and turned back. "We can't," Ethan began. "I love you," End said plain, clean. the kind of sentence that, once spoken, makes weather change. The forest flinched, 1,000 needles clicking. The fog lifted half an inch and then lowered, as if embarrassed to be caught eavesdropping. Ethan's face didn't move for a heartbeat, then two. Then his mouth softened in a way that had no place for mockery. "Okay," Ethan said, and the word was church and cussing at once. He glanced at the trees like a man reading a contract. "Okay," he said again, louder, as if making it official. "Me too." He took one step forward, and because consent has choreography, he stopped close enough that the air had to decide whose breath it belonged to. He put his hand on the back of Ent's neck, human and warm, and exactly as inevitable as gravity. Ent leaned, just enough to make it a secret among three parties, the two of them, and the mountain, which would, of course, hawk and swallow the sound. Which would, of course, hawk and swallow the sound.